Hey guys, it's Lance at Mac Sound Solutions, and I forgot to include something very important in my Ultimate Mac Pro in 2024 video. Check it out if you haven't seen it yet. As Steve Jobs used to say in his presentations, there's one more thing, and that one more thing is called Enable GOP. And I just gotta jump in here really quickly and just let you know this video is extremely long and technical, but I'm putting chapter markers so you can just skip to the parts that you need to actually do the install and not have to listen to all the gobbledygook. But I highly recommend you watch the entire video first so you really understand what you're doing and how cool it is that you can do this. All credit goes to BMJU for Enable GOP and others that worked on it with him. I'm not taking any credit for any of this. I had nothing to do with it. I just have done it myself, and I'm going to show you how to do it. There's already a video on YouTube by Jorg Hinenges, which is a good quick video, but I'm going into more detail trying to explain this. Of course, you can read all the information yourself on the MacRumors site, and I'll include all the links you need to be able to do this below in the video description. And even though I'm going to show you how to do it in this video, I highly suggest you read all the information so you get an idea of what you're doing and the risk that you're taking. So what is Enable GOP? It is a firmware driver to enable the native Apple boot picker and early macOS boot progress bar, plus other parts of the firmware UI, target disk mode, firmware password, internet recovery on machines which have it, etc., on non-natively supported GPUs, graphics cards. So basically, it's a firmware patch so you can flash your Mac Pro's internal boot ROM, or you can flash it to a graphics card. But honestly, flashing the graphics card that you have can be a lot trickier. The directions are here on MacRumors if you want to go that route. But the advantage of flashing your Mac Pro's boot ROM is that it's going to work with a whole list of different GPUs as opposed to just flashing an independent graphics card. There's a current list of tested GPUs that work with Enable GOP, and you will see noted on this list there's a couple of GPUs that do not work with Enable GOP. You have to use Enable GOP Direct. That file is also included in the Enable GOP folder, so if you have one of those two listed GPUs, use that version of Enable GOP Direct. And if you have a Radeon 7, it's recommended to reflash the VBIOS with the Radeon 7 Pro BIOS. Some graphics cards also come with dual BIOS switches on the card itself. If your GPU does have a dual BIOS like this RX 580, you have to have it in gaming mode, not compute mode, or full power mode, not low power mode. And if you bought a used graphics card, there is the possibility that the EFI was altered to enhance the card's capability for Bitcoin mining. And if that is the case, you need to download the original video BIOS for your card and reflash it with its original BIOS, and then it will work with Enable GOP. And some older graphics cards don't even have GOP, but there is a workaround for that, and I'll leave the link in the video description. And this works for all Mac Pro 4.1 and 5.1. Unfortunately, it does not work for the Mac Pro 3.1. Sorry, you're out of luck. So to make a long story short, if your graphics card is currently working with OpenCore, you're getting the OpenCore bootloader, that means you have a viable GOP, and Enable GOP will most likely work for you. Now granted, this is slightly risky because you're patching your boot ROM, and if you screw this up, you're going to brick your Mac. So you got to keep that in mind. Now let's get to the nitty-gritty of how to flash your boot ROM with Enable GOP. And again, you do this at your own risk. I am not responsible for you bricking your Mac, and I highly recommend you read all the directions from the original post on MacRumors so you get a real feel for what you're doing. I'm just a guy who owns a Mac Pro 5.1 and have modded the bejangies out of it. The other thing I want to talk about before we get into this is having a healthy boot ROM is important, because as the Mac Pro gets older and you have multiple reboots and multiple crashes and lots of kernel panics over the years, the garbage collection starts to fill up on the boot ROM and may not be cleaning itself out like it's supposed to, and your boot ROM is just getting too full. And correct Corrupt, which has very little space to begin with. It's just a little chip on the logic board that stores the firmware information for your Mac to boot. Step 1, downloads. We're going to download 3 different things from 3 different links, and all the links are in the video description in the order that I am presenting them. So first up is the full OpenCore package. We have to download that, OpenCore 0.9.7-release.zip. And when we open up the OpenCore folder, after unzipping it, we're going to go into Utilities and grab Enable GOP. That's the only thing we need from the OpenCore folder. And we're going to drag it to our desktop. Download number 2. And now we're going to grab MacSchrober's ROM dump utility, the second link down below in the video description. This is the app that not only reads your Mac Pro 5.1's boot ROM so you can save a copy of it, but it also analyzes it to see if there are any issues before moving forward with flashing Enable GOP. It will warn you if you have a lot of errors and issues with your boot ROM or it's too full. And if it is, then it's a good idea to have MacSchrober or TSI Alex on MacRumors do a reconstruction of your boot ROM. I'll talk about the rebuilding of your boot ROM a little later, but let's just go grab the third and final download that we need. And this is a little script file made by DOSDude, famous DOSDude patcher guy, dxeinject.zip. So we want to grab that. It's the last file that we need. Step 2, we're going to back up our ROM and analyze it using the MacSchrober ROM dump app. And I'm going to launch ROM dump MacSchrober app. We're going to hit backup firmware. Then we have to type in our administrative password, and it will save the ROM dump to your downloads folder. And it will also analyze your ROM and give you some information on it. Again, you don't want to share that with people unless it's like MacSchrober himself or TSI Alex. You can trust those guys, but don't share it with anybody else. But if you need a boot ROM reconstruction, you will have to send that over to them with some other information. So it's backing up my boot ROM to my downloads folder. That's where you'll find it after it's done, and it creates this report. And make sure to save your original boot ROM. You don't want to delete it after we make the new version of it. You want to keep both of them, and you want to put them somewhere safe. So back them up, don't trash them. Okay, so we now have a backed up boot ROM, and we now have a report of that backed up boot ROM. And as you can see in my report, it shows you that I've got Enable GOP already installed on my boot ROM. And then you can see your current boot ROM firmware number. And then going down the list, it shows you what hard drives you have installed with their names, and then it shows you the garbage collection for boots since last garbage collection, MTC counter 505 to 509. You know, some of this is kind of Greek to me, but MacSchrober told me the MTC counter represents the number of firmware boots since the last time the firmware was fully reset, in parentheses, by reconstruction or by deep NVRAM reset, which is resetting your PRAM 3 times in a row. In other words, holding down Command, Option, P, and R, and letting the Mac Pro chime 3 times. And my VSS1 and VSS2 show they're all okay. If you got errors on here, that's when you got to start thinking about having an expert look this over. Or if you have Microsoft certificates, those can be really troublesome, which means you boot it into Windows without the protection of OpenCore, and Windows has written certificates into your boot ROM. As you can see, I have 0 Microsoft certificates, and that's what you want. And then you can see how much free space you have on your boot ROM. Every time you boot and reboot your computer, this number changes, and if the garbage collection is working correctly, then it'll fill up and then it'll purge it and you'll have more free space again. But if there's issues, it may not be purging it, and that's what can lead to problems. Once the app gives you a report of your ROM, you do not want to share that publicly with anyone, because as MacSchrober warns, never post such a detailed dump to public sources. The dump and the big report contains loads of personal and machine data. So again, never ever post the shell script report. And each boot ROM is completely unique to your Mac Pro. You cannot flash your Mac Pro with somebody else's clean boot ROM, for instance. It has to be yours because the serial number and other code embedded in the firmware is unique to your specific Mac Pro. Step 3, organizing the downloaded files. So in the end, the only files you need are your backed up boot ROM, which I have renamed my serial number to Mac Pro serial number, but that's what the actual boot ROM looks like. It's a .bin file. Remember, we backed it up into our downloads folder, so I have moved that into my Enable GOP folder. I made another folder called All Other Files because there's a bunch of stuff in here in the Enable GOP folder that you don't need to do this, so I just put everything I didn't need in that extra folder to keep things neat and tidy. And then we have the Enable GOP-1.4.ffs. That is the only file out of the Enable GOP folder that you need. And then we have DOSDude's DXE inject file. And those are the 3 files we need to do the next step. To make our life easier, we're going to rename our ROM file, the long .bin file. I'm going to call mine lancerom.bin, but you can call yours whatever you want. Just don't leave any spaces. Just make it one word. Step 4, and this is a big one, we are now going to use the Terminal app to inject Enable GOP into our saved boot ROM. So we're going to launch Terminal, which is in your Applications Utilities folder. I keep Terminal in my dock, and we're going to type in BASH, then hit Return or Enter on your keyboard. And don't worry about this next message. We're just going to type this information, CD space desktop /enable GOP, hit enter, and then LS. Hit enter, and that will show us everything that is in that folder that's on the desktop, Enable GOP folder. And now we type in the command to inject Enable GOP into the boot ROM file. So /DXEINJECT space the name of your ROM. You can call it ROM if you want to. It doesn't have to be any specific name, but I just called it lancerom.bin, then another space, and new lancerom.bin. That'll be your new file that it creates. Then space enable GOP _1.4.ffs. Then hit enter. And as you can see, bingo, there is the new lancerom.bin. So that is the new ROM with Enable GOP injected into it. And that is the file we're going to flash into the Mac Pro. And just a footnote, if it didn't create that new file for you, the new bin file, it means you mistyped something in Terminal. You have to go in, quit Terminal, start it again, and do the whole sequence again from scratch. And just to make things easier, I moved the MacSchrober app into the Enable GOP folder. And before we do the flashing, we're just going to double check our ROM and make sure it's cool. So we're going to use MacSchrober's tool, and we're going to hit More instead of Flash Firmware or Backup Firmware. And we're going to click on Test a ROM Dump File. And we're going to go find the one we created, new lancerom.bin. Click on Choose, and it's going to analyze the ROM. Again, don't post this stuff online because it's got your serial number in there. You can see that we've got Enable GOP identified, and we've got lots of free space. And that's because I used the rebuilt boot ROM that MacSchrober made for me to create the new boot ROM with Enable GOP. One note before we move to flashing the firmware, if you have a Windows drive installed in your Mac Pro, I would remove it before doing the flashing because when you reboot, you want to make sure that OpenCore is still blessed and still working. And if it is, then you can put your Windows drive back in after the process is complete. Step 5, shut down your Mac and boot into firmware mode. So we're starting up the Mac and we're going to hold down the power button until it starts to flicker. And once it starts flickering, you can let up on it and then you're going to hear a long tone. And that's how you know you have booted into firmware mode. And be patient, it takes a little while. So you just got to keep holding down that button until you see it start to flicker. And once it does, then you can let up. So there we go, it's flickering, we let up. step 6, now that we're booted into firmware mode, we are going to use the ROM dump app to flash the new firmware.bin file into our Mac Pro. Okay, so now we're in firmware mode. We're going to launch Max Schraber's ROM dump app to flash our new firmware into the Mac Pro. So we're going to click on Flash Firmware. Then it's going to ask for your administrative password. Type that in, hit OK. It's doing some firmware programming mode. Now this is important. Flashing an invalid firmware could brick this Mac Pro if anything goes wrong or the SPI chip has bad cells. It could seriously harm this machine. Also, be prepared to eventually bless a bootloader like OpenCore if you flash a rebuild cleaned firmware. The easiest way is to pull all the drives but the one with OpenCore in the ESP upon the next reboot after flashing. In other words, if you did get a rebuilt boot ROM before you did this process, you're going to have to re-bless OpenCore. But if you're just using your current boot ROM and you put enable GOP in it, you should not have to re-bless OpenCore. And we hit confirm. And now we go find our new boot ROM, new Lance rom.bin. Choose. It's going to analyze it yet again and show you that everything is good to go. So I guess we didn't have to do that pre-analyzing job, but it's just a good idea to do it. And then we hit flash. I'm not going to flash mine because mine already has enabled GOP and I don't want to have to re-bless OpenCore. So eventually I may reflash this one back because it's a clean boot ROM. The process will take about 50 seconds, so just be patient. And then once it's done, you can reboot. And some final notes. I know this was a really long video and a long process, but the reality is it's a pretty quick process. I just wanted to cover all the information I could put into this video. And believe me, this was a painstaking video to make that I don't think that many people are going to watch. But what this does for you is give you the generic Apple bootloader, whether you're using OpenCore or not, with a GPU that is not an Apple GPU. So any of the GPUs that were listed earlier in the video will now get that gray Apple boot screen. So if you're not running OpenCore and you're just on Mojave and you have an RX 580 in your computer, without enabled GOP, you would just get a black screen until you got to the login when you first boot up the computer. But now you can boot up, you'll get the generic Apple boot screen, you'll be able to boot into recovery mode, select your different operating systems, and if you're using OpenCore, if you hold down the Option key at boot, you can get to the Apple bootloader before OpenCore loads. This is also very helpful if something goes belly up with OpenCore and you can't boot into your computer anymore. You can always throw your backup Mojave drive in there, get the Apple boot screen, re-bless your OpenCore drive, and away you go. You don't have to take out your GPU, put in the old Apple EFI GPU just to re-bless your OpenCore because you screwed something up with the config plist. And of course, this does not replace OpenCore when you're running a modern unsupported OS. It's more of a safety net for when things go wrong with OpenCore. So it's pretty damn cool, and we got to thank all the developers who put so much time into these things. There's donation spots where you can donate to them. If you use it, donate. And if you want to reach out to Max Schraber, his email is in the video description. I talked to him about it. He was cool with putting that in there if you want to reach out to get a rebuilt, reconstructed boot ROM. And today's sponsor is Initech. Initech makes all kinds of stuff for Macs. I am not sponsored by them, I'm just saying that. But I will leave the link in the description to this little hard drive enclosure. It's for small spinning drives, 2.5 drives, or SSDs. Not NVMEs, but just a regular 2.5-inch SSD. I have a 1 terabyte Samsung 870 EVO in it, and it gets about 500 megabytes per second read and write. What I really like about the enclosure is it has a rubber outer shell, which you can remove if you want, or you can buy it without it, save a couple of bucks. But I bought it with the rubber shell because it sits on top of the computer, it doesn't slide around, and it's got that little activity light. I don't like it when drives don't have an activity light like the SanDisk Extreme Pros. While they're fast and they're good drives, you can't tell if they're doing anything. So when you plug this drive in and you're starting to copy files, you get a tiny little LED that shows you there's some activity going on. I don't like drives that have really bright LEDs that light up your whole room at night, and this one just has a very small activity light, and I like that. So thumbs up, Initech. Link in the description. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to my channel. Give me that thumbs up. It means a lot, and I'll see you on the next Mac Sound Solutions video.